The Atlantic has many doors, some open to dark waters, others open to silence. December 1872. A merchant vessel cuts through thin fog. No wind, only a slow, heavy swell. Ahead, an unguided shadow appears. Sails torn, deck empty. The wheel turns on its own. No human voice answers. Welcome to the final morning of the Mary Celeste. If you are listening to my stories right now, I wonder, where in the world are you joining me from? Perhaps in the quiet of the night, or amidst the rush of the day. Wherever you are welcome here. But before we step further into the shadows of this enigma, if you are a soul drawn to the whispers of the past and the mysteries the world forgot, you have found your sanctuary. Join our growing circle of seekers by subscribing to Dreamy Old Stories. Together, let us journey into the depths of history where the truth remains hidden and every story carries a secret. Welcome back. This is Dreamy Old Stories. And today, we uncover a tale that was never meant to be told. The Atlantic carried the color of worn metal that morning. Far from land, where no church bell or harbor sound could travel, the sea opened in long gray folds beneath a pale winter sky. Thin fog hovered above the water in scattered layers, drifting low enough to dissolve the horizon into something uncertain and untrustworthy. A merchant vessel moved carefully through the cold, its hull pressing against slow swells that rose and sank with heavy, indifferent patience. Damp ropes strained against wooden beams darkened by salt and age. Every surface carried moisture. The deck breathed faintly of wet canvas, pine tar, and seawater that had soaked into timber through many long winters. Ahead, through shifting curtains of mist, another shape slowly materialized. At first it resembled part of the weather itself, something unfinished, suspended between sea and cloud. The men aboard the approaching vessel noticed the strange brigantine gradually, not through alarm, but through the quiet instincts formed during long weeks at sea. Someone heard loose rigging striking wood in an uneven rhythm carried across the wind. Another caught the faint groan of boards turning with the waves. The air held a deep cold that reached through wool coats and stiff gloves, settling into fingers already cracked from salt and rope work. Sea spray drifted in fine droplets across faces and disappeared into beards and collars. The ocean breathed slowly around them, exhaling mist that smelled of brine and distant rain. Gulls circled low for a moment before dissolving back into the white distance. Nothing moved quickly. Even sound seemed slowed and thickened by the damp, heavy morning air. As the vessels drew nearer, details emerged with uncomfortable clarity. The drifting ship leaned slightly as it traveled across the current at an uncertain angle, its sails partly set in careless, unintended arrangement. One loose line snapped sharply whenever the wind shifted. The wheel appeared unattended. No figure crossed the deck. No hand adjusted canvas or answered the distant calls sent across the water. A small boat should have rested beside the hull, but empty davits swung gently with each rise of the sea. Water lapped against the abandoned brigantine in hollow patterns that echoed beneath its frame. The fog thinned briefly, allowing the name painted across the stern to surface through layers of peeling salt and moisture. Then the mist gathered again, drawing the letters back into shadow. For the sailors watching from nearby, the sight carried a feeling impossible to explain aloud. Men who had spent years upon the Atlantic understood storms, broken masts, and sudden weather. Yet this scene unsettled them in quieter, more persistent ways. A ship was meant to contain human rhythm. Footsteps crossing planks before dawn, voices rising from below deck, lanterns moving behind cabin windows. Here there was only the shape of ordinary life emptied entirely of its people. The brigantine floated with the strange dignity of something interrupted in the middle of a sentence. Some of the crew stared without speaking, while others kept their hands occupied with rope or railing as if work itself might steady the mind. Beyond both ships, the winter sea stretched endlessly outward beneath the pale and exhausted morning light. The captain of the nearby vessel stood near the rail with a brass telescope pressed carefully against one eye. Moisture collected along the rim of the instrument as he studied the drifting brigantine through the pale morning haze. The sea around both ships had grown uneven, not violent, but restless in a slow and deliberate way that caused the hull beneath his boots to shift with heavy motion. Canvas overhead stirred in tired bursts whenever the wind freshened. From this closer distance, the abandoned vessel showed marks of ordinary travel rather than disaster. Its mast still stood firm against the sky. Sections of sail remained raised. Nothing appeared shattered or burned. Yet the arrangement of everything felt deeply incomplete, as though some invisible hand had pressed pause over the deck before any task could be finished. A boat was lowered carefully into the water. The men chosen to cross toward the drifting brigantine climbed down with cautious movements stiffened by cold air and thick clothing. Oars entered the sea with muted splashes that vanished quickly beneath the groaning breath of the Atlantic. The distance between the two vessels was not large, though the fog made it feel strangely elastic, as if the abandoned ship drifted farther away each time the rowboat advanced. Salt gathered on the men's gloves and sleeves. One sailor pulled his collar higher against the wind, while another kept glancing upward toward the silent rigging overhead. The brigantine rose above them gradually, its dark hull wet with seawater that reflected weak light from the pale sky like dull, reluctant glass. When the rowboat finally touched alongside the larger vessel, the sound startled everyone with its sharpness. Wood struck wood in a hollow knock that echoed briefly across the water before being swallowed by the fog. A rope ladder hung loosely against the hull, damp and swaying. One by one the sailors climbed upward, boots scraping against soaked timber polished smooth by years of storms and ocean spray. The deck greeted them with silence so complete that even their own breathing seemed intrusive. A lantern remained fixed near the cabin entrance, though daylight had fully arrived. Coiled rope rested beside barrels untouched. Near the stern, a cup lay overturned beside the rail with dried residue still clinging faintly to its inner rim. Small details waited everywhere, quiet fragments of interrupted routine scattered across the damp, indifferent boards. As the men slowly explored the brigantine, each room deepened the strange unease gathering among them. Below deck, narrow passageways carried the smell of wet wood, lamp oil, and seawater trapped within the ship's frame. A table inside the cabin held plates and utensils left behind in careless arrangement, as though those who used them expected to return within moments. One chair had tipped sideways against the floor during the ship's drifting movement. Clothing remained folded inside storage chests. Navigation instruments rested near charts that still lay open beneath weak light entering through the salt-streaked cabin windows. Nothing suggested hurried violence. Nothing resembled panic. Yet every ordinary object seemed burdened by absence, transformed by the simple fact that no human hand would reach toward it again. The deeper the sailors moved into the brigantine, the more carefully they stepped, as though sound itself might disturb something hidden within the vessel. Their boots crossed narrow corridors darkened by damp air and weak daylight filtering through small cabin windows streaked with salt. Water shifted softly below the floorboards with each slow rise of the sea. In the galley, cooking utensils hung from hooks that swayed gently whenever the ship rolled. A kettle rested cold upon the iron stove. Nearby shelves carried jars of flour, tea, and dried meat arranged with the quiet order of an unfinished voyage. One sailor touched the edge of a wooden counter and found it still faintly sticky from spilled syrup or molasses left behind days earlier. Such details felt disturbingly recent, as though time aboard the vessel had not passed, only paused. Above deck, the weather continued changing in subtle ways. The fog no longer drifted in heavy curtains but thinned into pale ribbons that exposed larger sections of sea around the ship. Weak sunlight pressed through the cloud cover for brief moments, casting a dim silver brightness across wet planks and tangled rope. The abandoned brigantine creaked constantly beneath these shifting conditions. Its mast chains rattled softly. Loose canvas fluttered in restless bursts overhead. Somewhere below, a door struck its frame again and again with slow, uneven rhythm caused by the ocean's movement. The sounds created the uneasy impression of activity aboard the ship, though every corner remained empty of life. Even the gulls that occasionally circled nearby refused to settle upon the silent, waiting deck. The sailors eventually gathered near the captain's cabin where the strongest signs of interruption seemed to linger. A bed remained partially made, blankets folded back unevenly as though someone had risen quickly before dawn. Papers lay scattered across a small desk beside an ink bottle tipped sideways from the motion of the sea. One man carefully lifted a navigation chart weighted at the corner by a brass compass. The lines drawn across the paper showed recent progress through Atlantic waters, yet no final destination appeared clearly marked. Nearby, a child's small shoe rested near the wall beside a wooden toy carved into the shape of a horse. The sight changed everything among the men at once. Until that moment, the ship had felt mysterious. Now it felt unbearably human. No one spoke loudly after that discovery. The sailors moved through the remaining rooms with slower hands and quieter expressions, noticing signs of family life woven among the practical routines of maritime travel. Sewing needles remained threaded beside folded cloth. A comb rested near a wash basin, still carrying faint traces of soap. One bunk contained a blanket stitched carefully with fading patterns of blue thread. The abandoned brigantine no longer resembled a ghostly object drifting through fog. It felt instead like a place where ordinary evenings had once unfolded beneath lantern light while the Atlantic rolled endlessly outside. Somewhere beyond the thin wooden walls, cold waves continued striking the hull with patient force, carrying the silent vessel farther into the vast and indifferent winter sea. By afternoon, the sea had darkened into deeper shades of gray, and the earlier softness of morning fog gave way to colder, sharper air. The abandoned brigantine drifted through long, rolling swells that lifted its hull with slow, uneven motion before lowering it again into shadowed troughs of water. From the deck, the Atlantic stretched outward in every direction with enormous emptiness, interrupted only by distant patches of pale light breaking through cloud cover far along the horizon. Damp ropes knocked softly against the mast whenever the ship leaned into the wind. Small streams of seawater traveled across the planks before slipping through narrow gaps in the timber. The vessel appeared physically intact, yet the longer one observed it, the more unnatural its condition became. Everything necessary for travel remained present except the people themselves. The crew from the nearby ship began carrying supplies and observations back and forth across the water, though even these practical tasks unfolded with unusual quietness. Oars dipped carefully into the cold sea while crates and lanterns passed from hand to hand without unnecessary conversation. The air smelled stronger now of salt and wet canvas as wind moved steadily across the open Atlantic. One sailor paused beside the rail of the abandoned vessel and listened to the layered sounds surrounding him. Rigging strained overhead with low rhythmic groans. Water slapped against the hull below. Somewhere inside the ship, unseen objects shifted slightly whenever the brigantine rolled across the swells. The combination created an uneasy illusion of hidden movement, as if the vessel itself continued living through old habits long after its passengers had vanished. As daylight slowly weakened, small discoveries continued shaping the thoughts of those aboard. Near the bow, one man noticed an axe resting beside a section of damaged railing where the wood had been cut or splintered in rough fashion. Another sailor found traces of water below deck, enough to dampen boots, but not enough to threaten the vessel itself. A length of rope dragged partially through the sea behind the ship, frayed near one end as though something heavy had once been secured there. Each detail encouraged new theories spoken quietly between the men. Perhaps a storm had frightened the passengers into the lifeboat. Perhaps some accident had forced them temporarily away from the ship. Yet none of the evidence settled comfortably into certainty. The brigantine offered fragments of explanation while withholding the larger, truest shape of what had happened. Toward evening, the emotional weight of the abandoned vessel began affecting even the most experienced sailors. Men accustomed to storms and long isolation found themselves speaking in softer tones or glancing instinctively toward empty passageways as darkness gathered along the deck. Lantern light now glowed against wet wood in trembling circles of gold that shifted with the movement of the sea. Beyond those small pockets of warmth, the ship dissolved gradually into shadow and cold mist. Some sailors imagined the final moments before abandonment. Others avoided imagining anything at all. The Atlantic surrounding them felt larger now, not because the ocean had changed, but because the silent brigantine revealed how quickly human presence could disappear within such boundless waters. Night approached slowly across the horizon while both vessels drifted beneath the fading winter sky. Night settled over the Atlantic with gradual heaviness, covering the sea in layers of dark blue and iron gray until the horizon disappeared completely from view. Clouds moved across the sky in broken formations, occasionally opening to reveal scattered stars trembling faintly above the water. Lanterns hanging aboard both vessels swayed with the rhythm of the swells, casting restless patterns across damp planks and coiled rope. The abandoned brigantine seemed altered by darkness. During daylight it had appeared mysterious. Now it carried a deeper, colder feeling of separation, as though the ship belonged less to ordinary travel and more to the endless, patient uncertainty of the sea itself. Wind traveled steadily through loose rigging overhead, producing long, mournful tones that drifted across the water like voices fading irretrievably into the cold, dark air. The sailors assigned to remain aboard the brigantine moved carefully through the dim corridors below deck, their lanterns revealing narrow sections of space surrounded by shadow. Every surface reflected moisture. Brass fixtures glimmered weakly beside dark wooden walls stained by years of salt and weather. One man paused beside the captain's cabin after hearing a sudden sound, only to realize it came from a swinging hook striking gently against the bulkhead with each movement of the ship. Another sailor climbed briefly above deck after smelling smoke, but found only the lingering scent of lamp oil carried downward by shifting wind. The vessel seemed full of these uncertain impressions. Small sounds emerged and disappeared. Familiar odors drifted unexpectedly through passageways. Ordinary details became unsettling simply because no living routine remained to explain them. Far across the black water, the lights of the second ship appeared small and distant despite the short stretch of ocean separating them. The men aboard the brigantine occasionally looked toward those faint lanterns for reassurance, as though human presence itself had become something precious in the strange silence surrounding them. One sailor sat briefly beside the rail and listened to waves breaking against the hull below. The sound carried endless variation. Some waves struck with hollow force, while others brushed softly along the timber like slow, unconscious breathing. Cold mist gathered in his beard and along the sleeves of his coat. Somewhere beyond the darkness, unseen currents continued guiding the abandoned vessel through Atlantic waters with patient indifference. The sea offered no explanation for the vanished passengers. It only carried the empty ship onward beneath the winter night. As the hours passed, exhaustion slowly replaced curiosity among the crew. Men wrapped themselves in thick coats while keeping watch near lantern light that flickered constantly in the moving air. Conversation drifted toward memories of home ports, crowded taverns, warm kitchens, and familiar streets far from the Atlantic cold. The abandoned brigantine encouraged such thoughts naturally. Its empty rooms and unfinished routines reminded everyone how fragile ordinary life could become once surrounded by open ocean. A meal left untouched, a chair standing beside a silent table, a child's belongings resting undisturbed near the cabin wall. These objects remained aboard the vessel like quiet echoes of people no longer present. Outside, darkness pressed heavily against the ship while waves rolled endlessly beneath the hull toward unseen distances hidden within the sleeping sea. Before dawn, the Atlantic entered one of its quieter moods. The stronger winds faded during the deepest hours of night, leaving the sea smoother though no less cold. Long black swells passed beneath the brigantine with slow measured motion that caused lantern light to drift gently across cabin walls and ceiling beams. Above deck, frost gathered in thin pale layers along sections of rope and railing exposed to the freezing air. The sailors keeping watch stamped their boots occasionally against the planks to restore feeling to stiffened feet. Breath rose visibly before their faces and vanished into darkness. Around them stretched an ocean so vast and unbroken that direction itself seemed uncertain. The abandoned vessel floated quietly within that enormous space, carried forward by currents older than any memory aboard the ship. As the eastern horizon slowly brightened, the brigantine revealed itself again in changing shades of gray. Details hidden during the night returned one by one beneath the weak approach of morning. Water droplets clung to rigging like small beads of cold glass. Torn edges of sailcloth fluttered faintly against the pale sky. The deck appeared emptier than before, perhaps because the silence of darkness had now passed into the clearer, more honest stillness of dawn. One sailor opened the cabin door and stood watching cold light spread gradually through the narrow room. The abandoned plates, scattered papers, and untouched belongings no longer felt dramatic or frightening. Instead, they carried the quiet sadness of interrupted ordinary life, the sadness of people who had once expected another morning at sea, unaware that their final night aboard had already come and gone. The captain eventually ordered preparations to guide the brigantine towards safer waters where officials could inspect the vessel more carefully. Ropes were secured between the two ships, while crewmen moved steadily through practiced routines shaped by years upon the Atlantic. Yet, even during these practical efforts, attention continued drifting back toward unanswered questions. Men studied the damaged railing again. They examined the empty space where the lifeboat should have rested. Some searched the horizon instinctively, as though a small boat carrying survivors might suddenly emerge from the pale winter fog. Nothing appeared except sea and sky blending together in distant gray layers. The Atlantic kept its silence completely, offering wind, current, and weather, but no clear account of what had happened aboard the drifting brigantine during those vanished days. When the sun finally rose higher above the horizon, its weak light spread across both vessels in muted silver tones that reflected softly from the cold water. The brigantine now traveled slowly beside another ship once more, no longer alone upon the Atlantic. Yet the feelings surrounding it remained deeply, stubbornly isolated. Sailors continued glancing toward empty windows and silent passageways while the sea carried them onward through the winter morning. Far below the hull, unseen currents moved patiently through dark water untouched by human mystery or fear. The ocean had witnessed storms, disappearances, and forgotten voyages long before these men crossed its surface. Somewhere within that endless history, the abandoned brigantine would soon become another story passed quietly between sailors during long nights at sea. And beyond the drifting fog, the Atlantic continued breathing beneath the pale cold sky. The wood holds memory, the salt holds truth, but the ocean tells no secrets. How did an entire family vanish, leaving their cold tea and a child's toy behind? To understand the quiet horror on this deck, we must look backward. We must see where this timber was born. Along the cold shoreline of Nova Scotia, shipyards once stretched beside dark tidal waters where forests met the Atlantic wind. In the early mornings, before smoke fully lifted from nearby chimneys, workers gathered among stacks of timber waiting beside the shore. Pine and oak beams lay arranged in long rows dampened by sea mist and winter frost. The future brigantine began there as separate pieces of wood shaped slowly by saws, planes, and iron tools worn smooth from years of labor. Shipbuilders moved carefully across muddy ground, carrying heavy planks upon their shoulders while gulls circled overhead, searching among scraps left near the water. Nearby warehouses breathed of tar, rope fiber, coal smoke, and fresh lumber newly cut from inland forests. Inside the shipyard, the sounds of construction created a steady atmosphere that settled into daily life around the harbor. Hammers struck iron nails with dull repeating force that echoed against nearby buildings and drifted outward across the tide. Men heated pitch above open fires until thick smoke merged with the sharp scent of resin and wet bark. Sawdust gathered across boots and coat sleeves while cold wind carried traces of salt water through the unfinished frame of the vessel. Some workers paused briefly during meals beside barrels or crates, warming stiff hands around cups of tea before returning to labor. Horses pulled wagons loaded with timber through narrow streets where mud deepened after rain. The harbor remained busy from dawn until evening light faded behind the shoreline hills. As weeks passed, the vessel slowly rose above the edge of the water in recognizable form. Curved ribs shaped the body of the ship first, followed by outer planks fastened tightly along the growing hull. Masts arrived later, hauled carefully toward the shoreline by teams of workers guiding heavy ropes across frozen ground. Children from nearby homes occasionally gathered near the shipyard fences to watch the progress from a distance. Some evenings brought snowfall that settled across unfinished decks and dark beams before melting again beneath weak sunlight the following day. Merchants visited to inspect the developing vessel, while shipyard owners discussed cargo routes and future contracts beside ledgers marked with careful handwriting. The brigantine entered existence gradually through weather, labor, and patient routine rather than any dramatic moment of creation. To those involved in its building, the ship represented ordinary hopes connected to trade and survival along the Atlantic coast. Shipbuilders thought about wages waiting at the end of long weeks rather than future mystery. Merchants imagined barrels of flour, timber, and manufactured goods crossing safely between distant ports. Sailors who later stepped aboard would notice practical details before beauty: strong rigging, reliable storage space, a sturdy hull capable of enduring rough weather. No one standing within the muddy shipyard could have imagined that decades later strangers would whisper about the vessel with uneasy fascination. At that time, it belonged completely to the familiar world of maritime commerce, where hundreds of similar ships carried cargo quietly between cold harbors beneath changing northern skies. When the brigantine finally entered the water for the first time, the event unfolded with modest ceremony beside the harbor. Workers gathered along the shoreline wearing thick coats darkened by sawdust and salt air, while the vessel rested upon wooden supports above the tide. Ropes creaked under strain as shipyard crews prepared the launch during a pale gray morning touched by freezing wind. Women and children stood farther back near storage buildings, watching quietly from the muddy edge of the road. The hull carried the rich color of fresh timber coated in protective oils that reflected weak light from the harbor. At the proper moment, wedges were removed one by one, and the heavy ship slid gradually toward the sea with deep groaning sounds that rolled across the waterfront like distant, reluctant thunder. The harbor welcomed the new vessel through a mixture of noise, movement, and weather familiar to Atlantic towns during the 19th century. Waves struck wooden piers carrying the smell of seaweed and cold salt water into the crowded docks. Nearby fishing boats returned with wet nets piled heavily across their decks, while merchants shouted cargo numbers beside stacks of barrels and crates. Black smoke drifted from chimneys above warehouses storing flour, rum, dried cod, and imported fabric. Inside taverns near the shoreline, sailors stamped rainwater from their boots before gathering beside dim fires and rough wooden tables. The brigantine entered this environment naturally, another working vessel among many others already traveling between ports shaped by trade, labor, and uncertain weather. Nothing about the ship invited special attention during those early years. As seasons passed, the brigantine developed its own quiet rhythm through repeated voyages across northern waters. Crews loaded timber in one harbor before carrying coal, flour, or manufactured goods toward another coastline farther south. The vessel crossed through fog, rain, freezing wind, and calmer summer tides that glittered beneath long evening light. Repairs became part of ordinary routine. Torn canvas required stitching after storms. Salt stiffened ropes until sailors replaced worn sections piece by piece. Paint faded beneath harsh Atlantic weather and was brushed over again during dockside maintenance. Captains changed. Crew members came and went according to contracts, illness, or opportunity elsewhere. Through these gradual transitions, the ship remained part of commercial life rather than legend, earning modest profit through dependable travel between ports connected by sea routes and seasonal demand. For the people who worked aboard her, the brigantine often became less a machine and more a temporary floating world shaped by repetition and close proximity. Sailors learned the sounds of specific floorboards beneath their boots and recognized weather changes through shifts in air pressure or movement beneath the hull. Meals were eaten beside swinging lanterns while storms rattled the outer walls during difficult crossings. Long hours encouraged quiet observation of sea and sky rather than conversation. Some men carved initials into hidden sections of wood during idle moments at anchor. Others carried letters folded carefully inside coat pockets waiting for arrival at distant ports. The vessel absorbed these small human traces year after year, becoming tied not to mystery yet, but to the ordinary emotional texture of maritime life along the Atlantic trade routes. During long trading seasons, the The brigantine traveled steadily between small ports scattered along the Atlantic coastline and farther southern waters where climates softened and harbors grew louder with commerce. Each destination carried its own physical character. Some docks were lined with rough stone walls darkened by spray and winter rain. Others opened into warmer towns where palm leaves shifted above crowded waterfront streets filled with carts, animals, and shouting laborers. The ship adapted to each environment through practical necessity rather than elegance. Its hull collected scratches from repeated contact with piers and cargo cranes. Iron fittings rusted slowly beneath damp ocean air. Layers of repair accumulated quietly over time, giving the vessel the worn and honest appearance shared by many working ships that spent years crossing difficult waters beneath changing skies. Life aboard the brigantine shaped itself around sensation more than comfort. The smell below deck changed constantly according to the cargo resting within the hold. One voyage carried timber scented with pine resin and wet bark. Another filled the ship with the dusty dryness of flour sacks stacked tightly against wooden beams. During warmer crossings, molasses and rum created heavy sweetness that drifted upward through narrow corridors and sleeping quarters. Sailors grew familiar with the constant movement beneath their feet. Plates rattled softly during meals. Lantern flames bent sideways when strong winds struck the sails above. Clothing remained slightly damp for weeks at a time from sea mist and cramped living conditions. Even sleep arrived unevenly, interrupted by shifting weather, creaking timbers, or sudden calls from the deck during rough nights at sea. Over the years, ownership of the brigantine changed through sales, partnerships, and financial arrangements common within maritime trade. Names painted across the stern were replaced more than once as merchants bought or transferred the vessel between companies and captains. New paperwork followed each transaction, while the ship itself continued much as before, crossing familiar routes beneath different flags or business agreements. Certain modifications appeared gradually. Storage areas were altered to fit changing cargo demands. Cabin walls were repaired after damage from storms or hard voyages. Fresh coats of paint briefly restored brightness before Atlantic weather softened the colors again into faded, salt-worn tones. The brigantine moved through these adjustments quietly, shaped less by dramatic events than by accumulated years of labor spread across countless ordinary journeys through cold and warm seas alike. For many sailors, ships like this brigantine represented a strange mixture of hardship and belonging difficult to describe to those living ashore. Ports offered temporary excitement, yet long stretches at sea created habits of thought tied closely to the vessel itself. Men learned where sunlight entered the deck first at dawn, or how certain ropes sounded in strong wind compared to calm weather. Familiar routines developed around watches, meals, maintenance, and changing tides. Some sailors spoke softly to the ship during storms while securing sails or checking damaged rigging in darkness. Others viewed such behavior with amusement, yet still touched wooden beams instinctively before dangerous crossings. Over time, the brigantine gathered these quiet emotional connections from many different crews, carrying fragments of human attachment long before history surrounded the vessel with unanswered questions. Merchant trade across the Atlantic depended less on adventure than on repetition shaped by weather, schedules, and practical necessity. The brigantine spent many of its years following familiar routes between coastal towns where docks smelled of fish oil, coal smoke, wet rope, and rain-soaked timber. Cargo arrived in endless variation according to season and demand. Barrels rolled across planks with hollow sounds while dock workers shouted measurements beside ledgers spotted with seawater and ink. During colder months, Frost gathered along harbor posts before sunrise and cracked beneath heavy boots carrying supplies toward the ship. Summer voyages felt different. Warm air drifted through open hatches carrying the scent of fruit, tar, and distant cooking fires from crowded waterfront streets where trade continued late into the evening beneath lantern light. The crew lived within routines so constant that small details became markers of passing time. Morning watches began before daylight, while the sea remained dark and heavy beneath the hull. Sailors climbed rigging with stiff hands numbed by cold wind and damp canvas. Coffee boiled slowly in the galley while footsteps echoed overhead across the deck. Meals often tasted of salt meat, bread hardened by storage, and tea brewed in blackened kettles worn smooth from years of use. Clothing dried poorly inside cramped sleeping quarters where moisture collected against walls and blankets. Some afternoons passed in calmer weather when crewmen repaired torn sails or scrubbed sections of deck, while gulls followed overhead searching for scraps. These routines shaped daily existence more powerfully than distant destinations marked upon navigation charts. The brigantine gradually developed signs of age visible to anyone familiar with maritime work. Timber darkened where seawater entered through repeated storms and harsh crossings. Sections of deck required replacement after heavy winters weakened exposed wood. Iron nails loosened slightly within older beams until ship carpenters reinforced them during repairs at port. New ropes contrasted sharply against faded rigging that had survived years beneath Atlantic weather. Even the sound of the vessel changed over time. Older ships carried deeper groans when waves pressed against the hull at difficult angles. Experienced sailors noticed these subtle differences immediately, listening almost instinctively to the language of creaking timber and shifting cargo below deck. The brigantine aged gradually through use rather than neglect, shaped continuously by labor, weather, and the long demands of commercial travel. For those connected to the vessel, the ship slowly blended into memory as part of ordinary working life rather than something extraordinary. Merchants remembered delayed shipments or profitable cargo more than the appearance of the brigantine itself. Dockworkers recognized the hull from previous arrivals and returned casually to unloading crates or barrels without ceremony. Sailors signed contracts, completed voyages, and eventually departed for other ships carrying different routes or opportunities. Yet traces of personal experience remained quietly attached to the vessel. A repaired section of railing recalled one violent storm. Scratched initials near a bunk preserved idle conversations from distant crossings. A stain near the galley floor marked years of spilled coffee and seawater. These small accumulations gave the brigantine a quiet human texture long before later events transformed the ship into a subject of uneasy fascination across the Atlantic world. As the years moved forward, the brigantine crossed through many different moods of the Atlantic, each voyage adding another layer to its long working life. Winter passages carried freezing spray that hardened along the rails and rigging until sailors chipped ice away with stiff hands before dawn. Autumn journeys often unfolded beneath low skies where rain drifted across the sea for days at a time, soaking sails and darkening every plank aboard the vessel. In calmer seasons, sunlight spread warmly across the deck, while distant coastlines appeared through soft blue haze near evening. Harbors arrived one after another with familiar patterns of arrival and departure. Bells rang from waterfront churches. Horses pulled wagons beside crowded piers. Crates disappeared into warehouses while new cargo replaced them for the next crossing waiting beyond the tide. The emotional atmosphere aboard the brigantine shifted according to weather, exhaustion, and the changing mix of crew members who shared its narrow spaces. Some voyages passed quietly, with little conversation beyond necessary commands shouted through wind and rain. Other journeys carried bursts of laughter rising from the galley after meals, or stories exchanged beside lantern light during calmer watches. Tobacco smoke drifted through sleeping quarters where damp clothing hung beside hammocks swinging gently with the sea. Sailors learned each other's habits through long exposure. One man hummed softly while coiling rope. Another sharpened knives during idle afternoons at anchor. A cook with rough, scarred hands stirred heavy stews while the ship rolled beneath him. These ordinary human patterns gave warmth to the vessel, shaping its atmosphere far more than the cargo resting silently below deck. Small developments continued altering the brigantine over time in ways barely noticed during daily routine. Additional storage compartments were added beneath sections of deck to increase carrying capacity during profitable trading seasons. Cabin furniture shifted according to changing captains and owners who preferred different arrangements for charts, instruments, or sleeping space. Paint peeled beneath harsh weather before being replaced in slightly different shades chosen by whichever port supplied materials most cheaply at the time. Even the smell of the ship evolved gradually through years of absorbed cargo, smoke, seawater, and human presence embedded deeply into old timber. The brigantine became less like a newly constructed vessel and more like a layered record of practical decisions shaped by commerce and survival along Atlantic trade routes stretching across many distant ports. To later generations, the ship would eventually seem wrapped in mystery. Yet during these earlier years, its life carried little romance or drama for those who knew it closely. Most people encountered the brigantine briefly before returning to their own routines ashore or aboard other vessels. Harbor clerks recorded arrivals and ledgers before moving immediately to the next transaction. Laborers unloaded cargo while thinking about wages, weather, or family concerns waiting beyond the docks. Sailors stepped off the ship after long voyages, searching first for warmth, food, and sleep rather than reflection about the sea. The brigantine belonged fully to this practical world of trade and labor. Its future reputation remained completely unimaginable then, hidden somewhere far ahead beyond countless ordinary tides rolling patiently through the cold Atlantic darkness. By the time the brigantine approached the later years of its working life, the Atlantic world around it had already begun changing in quiet but important ways. Steam-powered vessels appeared more frequently near busy harbors, their dark funnels releasing smoke above the water, while older sailing ships continued relying upon wind and tide. The brigantine still moved through familiar trade routes, yet its presence belonged increasingly to an earlier rhythm shaped by canvas sails, shifting currents, and patient navigation across open sea. Along crowded docks, newer technologies arrived beside older maritime traditions that had endured for generations. Iron hulls reflected gray daylight beside wooden vessels stained by tar and seawater. Harbor conversations mixed practical excitement about modern commerce with lingering trust in the older sailing ships that many captains still preferred for certain routes and cargo. The experience of traveling aboard the brigantine carried a physical texture impossible to separate from the vessel itself. Every movement of the sea traveled directly through the wooden structure into the bodies of those living aboard. Sailors felt weather changes through vibration beneath their boots long before storms fully arrived. During difficult crossings, sleeping became uneven as waves struck the hull with heavy force that rattled shelves, lanterns, and loose utensils deep into the night. In calmer weather, sunlight warmed sections of deck carrying the mixed scents of rope fiber, tobacco smoke, seawater, and aging timber. Meals eaten beside swaying lanterns developed their own familiar comfort despite rough conditions. The brigantine surrounded its crews completely, shaping how they slept, worked, listened, and understood the Atlantic itself through daily contact with wind and water. Gradually, the ship passed into new ownership once again, bringing another series of practical changes that quietly prepared it for the chapter history would later remember most clearly. Repairs strengthened sections weakened by years of trade voyages. Fresh paint covered faded surfaces, while rigging received replacement lines purchased from coastal suppliers. Cargo arrangements shifted toward longer journeys carrying alcohol and industrial goods between distant ports connected through expanding maritime commerce. Paperwork changed hands inside offices smelling of ink, damp wool, and coal heat, while signatures transferred responsibility for the aging brigantine from one owner to another. No dramatic announcement marked these transitions. They unfolded through ordinary meetings, business agreements, and harbor routines repeated countless times throughout the 19th century along Atlantic trade networks shaped by weather and economic necessity. Yet beneath all these ordinary details, the brigantine carried something quietly human gathered through decades of labor and travel. The vessel had absorbed voices, habits, frustrations, hopes, and exhaustion from many different crews who crossed its decks during storms and calmer evenings alike. Worn railings reflected the touch of countless hands steadying themselves against rough seas. Scratches carved into wood preserved moments of boredom, loneliness, or companionship shared far from land. The ship remained deeply ordinary in its purpose, but years of continuous human presence gave it a subtle emotional weight difficult to notice while events unfolded normally. Long before mystery surrounded the brigantine, it had already become a container for accumulated lives drifting slowly across the Atlantic beneath changing skies, carrying trade, routine, memory, and quiet traces of everyone who once called the vessel home. Years passed in silence. The ship survived storms and changing flags. It was a normal merchant brigantine, until a captain named Benjamin Briggs stepped onto the deck, bringing his family with him. Captain Benjamin Briggs carried the appearance of a man shaped gradually by years upon the Atlantic. His beard remained carefully trimmed, and his dark coats often carried the faint stiffness left by salt air and winter travel. In port towns, he moved with the measured habits common among experienced sea captains who spent long periods balancing discipline with patience. Beside him, Sarah Briggs brought a quieter domestic presence into the demanding world of maritime trade. Trunks waited near the docks packed with folded dresses, wool blankets, writing paper, and small personal belongings chosen carefully for long travel at sea. Their young daughter carried dolls, ribbons, and children's books that seemed delicate beside coils of rope, cargo crates, and weathered harbor equipment surrounding the vessel before departure. Inside the family quarters prepared aboard the brigantine, ordinary household sensations blended gently with the harsher atmosphere of the ship itself. The cabin breathed faintly of lamp oil, polished wood, dried tea leaves, and seawater drifting inward through narrow windows. Sarah arranged blankets and clothing inside storage chests while footsteps from the deck echoed softly overhead. A prayer book rested beside neatly folded garments on the small table near the bed. Nearby, a cup of cooling tea released thin traces of steam into the cold morning air, entering through cracks along the cabin frame. Their daughter's quiet laughter occasionally rose above the muted sounds of harbor labor outside, where gulls cried over the docks and distant wagon wheels rattled across uneven streets lined with warehouses and taverns. As the final days before departure unfolded, Small preparations continued shaping the family's temporary life aboard the vessel. Benjamin reviewed navigation charts beneath weak evening lantern light, while Sarah completed handwritten letters intended for relatives remaining ashore. Crew members carried additional provisions into the hold, including flour, fresh water, preserved meat, and barrels prepared for the coming voyage. The child wandered curiously through sections of the deck before being gently guided away from ropes and cargo equipment by attentive sailors. Weather shifted frequently during those days. Rain darkened the harbor one afternoon before clearing into pale sunlight reflected across wet planks and rigging. With each passing hour, the brigantine moved gradually from familiar domestic routine toward the uncertain rhythm of open water and distant Atlantic crossings. For the Briggs family, the ship represented more than commerce or transportation. It formed a temporary home carried slowly across dangerous seas through trust, habit, and shared belief. Benjamin viewed maritime work with deep seriousness shaped by religious conviction and personal responsibility toward both crew and family. Sarah accepted the confined world of shipboard life with calm practicality rather than excitement, bringing pieces of domestic order into narrow wooden rooms surrounded constantly by weather and ocean. Their daughter likely understood the voyage differently, noticing perhaps only the movement of sails, strange harbor sounds, and changing water beyond the rail. Together they entered the brigantine carrying private hopes, routines, and quiet emotional bonds that would soon become inseparable from the larger mystery remembered long after the voyage itself disappeared into Atlantic history. During the final evenings before departure, the brigantine slowly transformed from a working cargo vessel into a lived domestic space shaped by family routine and personal habit. Sarah Briggs arranged small belongings carefully inside the narrow cabin, placing folded clothing into drawers that shifted gently whenever the tide moved beneath the hull. A sewing kit rested beside neatly stacked letters tied together with faded ribbon. Benjamin stored navigation instruments and journals near his desk where maps already weighted beneath brass weights to prevent them from curling in the damp sea air. Their daughter carried toys between the bed and cabin floor while lantern light moved softly across the wooden walls. Outside the small windows, harbor activity continued into darkness as workers loaded supplies beneath drifting smoke and cold Atlantic wind. Life aboard the vessel carried a particular sensory closeness unfamiliar to many people ashore. Every room absorbed sound from elsewhere on the ship. Footsteps overhead traveled through ceiling beams. Voices from the deck arrived softened through layers of timber and canvas. The scent of seawater entered constantly, mixing with soap, damp wool, tea leaves, lamp smoke, and traces of preserved food stored nearby for the voyage ahead. At night, the family could hear waves striking the hull below their cabin with hollow rhythmic force, while rigging tapped softly against the mast outside. Even moments of quiet carried texture. Pages turned carefully beneath lantern light. Drawers slid open with faint scraping sounds, and wind brushed against the outer walls as though the Atlantic itself already waited beyond the harbor for their approaching departure. The daily rhythm aboard the brigantine began settling into place before the ship even left port. Benjamin spent long hours reviewing cargo records, speaking with crew members, and checking weather conditions that shifted across the harbor each morning. Sarah wrote final correspondence at the small cabin table while occasionally pausing to steady her hand when wagons or loading cranes caused the vessel to rock gently against the dock. Their daughter watched sailors work with fascinated attention, sometimes standing near the rail beside coils of rope larger than herself. Small adjustments continued everywhere. Extra blankets were added after colder winds arrived from the north. A damaged lantern hook required repair. Fresh bread and fruit came aboard shortly before sailing, bringing brief warmth and sweetness into the increasingly crowded atmosphere below deck. Beneath these practical routines rested a quiet emotional understanding shared by maritime families of the 19th century. Sea voyages carried uncertainty so common that many people accepted it almost as part of ordinary existence. Farewells at the docks were often restrained rather than dramatic, shaped by experience and repetition across generations connected to Atlantic trade. Benjamin likely understood the risks more clearly than anyone aboard, yet his calm behavior suggested confidence formed through years at sea. Sarah brought steadiness of another kind, preserving familiar domestic habits within the confined world of the brigantine. Together they created a fragile sense of home surrounded by cargo, weather, and open water waiting just beyond the harbor mouth where the Atlantic stretched outward into distant and unknowable horizons. Once the brigantine finally departed the harbor, the family settled gradually into the enclosed rhythm of life at sea. The shoreline faded slowly behind them beneath pale morning light, while gulls followed overhead for a time before turning back toward land. Within the cabin, Sarah arranged daily necessities so they would remain secure during rougher movement across the Atlantic. Cups were placed carefully within narrow shelves bordered by wooden rails. Books and folded letters rested inside storage compartments beneath the bed. Benjamin's navigation tools occupied their own precise positions near charts spread across the captain's desk. Their daughter adapted quickly to the unfamiliar environment, learning how to balance herself against shifting floors while moving through passageways filled with the smell of salt air, lamp smoke, and aging timber dampened by ocean spray. The sensory experience aboard the brigantine changed continuously according to weather and time of day. Mornings carried cold, damp air drifting through the cabin windows along with the distant cries of sailors working above deck. During meals, the scent of boiled coffee, preserved meat, and warm bread moved through the narrow living space, while lantern flames trembled gently beside the walls. At night, the sea became more present. Waves struck the hull beneath the family quarters with deeper force, creating long, hollow sounds that echoed through the ship's frame. Wind pressed against the outer planks while rigging overhead produced soft, irregular music shaped by changing currents and shifting sails. Even sleep arrived within constant motion as beds creaked slightly and loose objects clicked faintly against wooden surfaces whenever the brigantine rolled across uneven water. As days passed, the family's routines adjusted naturally to maritime life. Benjamin divided his attention between navigation, crew management, and brief, quiet moments spent with Sarah and their daughter below deck. He often returned to the cabin carrying traces of cold wind and seawater upon his coat after long hours above. Sarah maintained small household rituals that brought familiarity into the uncertain environment surrounding them. Folding clothing carefully after washing, reading from her prayer book during calmer evenings, and writing occasional notes about the voyage while seated near the lantern light. Their daughter explored small sections of the ship under watchful supervision, growing curious about ropes, sails, and the changing appearance of sea and sky beyond the rail. These ordinary actions slowly transformed the brigantine into a temporary floating household shaped by repetition and close human presence. For the Briggs family, time aboard the ship likely carried a strange balance between isolation and closeness. The Atlantic separated them physically from ordinary society, yet the confined world of the brigantine encouraged constant awareness of one another's habits, moods, and movements. Small gestures gained quiet importance within such limited space. a shared cup of tea during rough weather, a bedtime story read beside swaying lantern light, a brief conversation after the child had fallen asleep and the sounds of the sea filled the cabin walls. Maritime life reduced certain distractions while deepening attention toward routine domestic moments. Surrounded endlessly by water and weather, the family turned inward, building emotional shelter through ordinary affection and disciplined habit as the brigantine continued outward across the cold Atlantic world. The longer the brigantine traveled across open water, the more completely daily life aboard became shaped by routine rather than destination. Morning light entered the family cabin differently according to weather and sea conditions. Some dawns arrived through pale gray fog that softened every surface within the room. Other mornings carried sharp sunlight reflecting from restless waves outside the windows. Benjamin usually rose early before much activity stirred below deck, preparing quietly for the responsibilities waiting above. Sarah followed her own rhythm within the confined domestic space, straightening blankets loosened during the night and organizing the small belongings that shifted whenever the sea grew rougher. Their daughter often woke slowly beneath the gentle movement of the ship, listening first to footsteps overhead or distant calls exchanged between sailors across the deck. The physical atmosphere aboard the brigantine continued changing with each passing day at sea. Damp air settled into clothing hung near the walls and left a cool texture across blankets and wooden furniture. During rougher weather, lanterns swung more heavily from ceiling hooks, while dishes rattled softly within storage shelves. The family ate meals accompanied by the constant sounds of maritime labor drifting downward from above, boots crossing the deck, ropes straining sharply through pulleys, wind pressing against sails with low rushing force that deepened whenever storms approached from distant sections of the Atlantic. Yet calmer periods brought different sensations entirely. Afternoon sunlight warmed sections of the cabin floor while softer waves allowed the vessel to travel with slower, steadier motion beneath the surrounding sky and open sea. Small developments unfolded naturally within the family's shared life aboard the vessel. Sarah gradually learned which objects required securing before weather changed suddenly, and which corners of the cabin remained warmest during colder nights at sea. Benjamin occasionally brought small gifts below deck after long watches above, perhaps fruit saved from the galley or interesting shells gathered during brief stops at harbor. Their daughter grew increasingly comfortable exploring familiar areas of the ship, waving shyly towards sailors who smiled while continuing their work near the rigging or cargo hold. Even the crew adjusted subtly to the family's presence aboard. Voices softened near the cabin after evening hours. Sailors stepped carefully around toys or personal belongings left briefly along passageways. The brigantine slowly developed the atmosphere of a shared floating household rather than a vessel occupied only by working men and commercial cargo. Within such close surroundings, emotional understanding often emerged through observation more than conversation. Benjamin likely carried the private weight of command constantly, balancing concern for crew, cargo, weather, and family within the uncertain environment of Atlantic travel. Sarah may have sensed those quiet pressures through changes in his expression after difficult days at sea or longer silences during meals beneath lantern light. Yet the confined nature of shipboard life also encouraged moments of unusual intimacy impossible within larger households ashore. Family members remained physically near one another through storms, calm evenings, routine meals, and sleepless nights shaped by wind and waves. The brigantine carried not only cargo across the Atlantic, but also the delicate emotional world of a small household moving together through isolation, weather, responsibility, and the long, uncertain distance between distant shores. Certain evenings aboard the brigantine unfolded with unusual calm, allowing the family to experience the Atlantic in gentler ways rarely remembered in accounts of maritime life. After the crew completed their duties and darkness spread gradually across the sea, quieter hours settled over the vessel. Lantern light glowed warmly inside the cabin, while waves moved with slower rhythm beneath the hull. Benjamin sometimes sat beside the small table reviewing notes or navigation records while Sarah mended clothing near the lamp with careful hands practiced through years of domestic work. Their daughter listened to stories or traced patterns in the wood grain beside her bed before sleep arrived. Outside, the sails shifted softly against the night wind as stars appeared between moving clouds over the dark Atlantic horizon. The emotional texture of these evenings came not from dramatic events, but from small shared experiences shaped by confinement and repetition. Tea warmed slowly inside metal cups while seawater tapped gently against the outer planks. The cabin carried layers of familiar scent gathered through days at sea. Wax from candles, damp wool coats drying near the wall, ink spread across open journals, salt air drifting inward through narrow cracks beside the windows. During rough weather, conversation became shorter as everyone focused instinctively on the ship's movement and the changing sounds above deck. But calmer nights encouraged quieter reflection. Benjamin occasionally read aloud from religious texts or newspapers carried from port, his voice blending with the low creaking of timber and distant footsteps from sailors continuing their watches beneath the stars. As the voyage continued, small signs of fatigue and adaptation appeared naturally within the family's routines. Sarah's handwriting in letters and journal notes likely shifted slightly with the movement of the sea beneath her chair. Benjamin spent longer periods above deck studying weather conditions as Atlantic currents and winds changed around the brigantine. Their daughter grew more accustomed to the ship's confined spaces and wandering motion, treating narrow corridors and cabin steps as familiar parts of everyday life. Crew members developed habits around the family as well. Some sailors offered small carved toys or bits of conversation during calmer afternoons. Others maintained respectful distance while carrying out work among cargo, rigging, and sails weathered by salt and wind. The brigantine continued functioning through these overlapping layers of labor, domestic life, and maritime discipline. For those aboard, the ship gradually became a world separated from ordinary time ashore. Days blended together through repeated tasks, shifting weather, and endless views of sea and sky stretching beyond the rail in every direction. Letters written in the cabin would not reach land for many weeks. News from distant towns no longer arrived regularly. The family lived instead within the immediate reality of the brigantine itself. Wind direction mattered more than dates upon calendars. Water supplies and sail conditions shaped daily decisions more directly than events occurring far beyond the Atlantic horizon. Yet within that isolation, the Briggs household preserved familiar forms of tenderness and order. Their routines created emotional stability inside an environment defined constantly by uncertainty, movement, and the immense surrounding presence of the open sea. As the brigantine moved farther from familiar coastlines, the distinction between household life and maritime labor grew increasingly difficult to separate. The same winds that filled the sails also entered the family cabin through narrow seams in the wooden walls. The same ocean carrying cargo across the Atlantic shaped the mood of each meal, each conversation, and each night's sleep aboard the vessel. Benjamin often crossed between these two worlds many times within a single day. One moment standing above deck, speaking firmly with sailors beside straining rigging, soon afterward returning below, carrying wet gloves and cold air into the quieter domestic space Sarah had carefully maintained within the cramped cabin. The ship gathered all aspects of existence together beneath one moving roof of timber, canvas, rope, and weather. Physical life aboard continued, leaving subtle marks upon everyone within the brigantine. Sarah's dresses absorbed the scent of seawater and lamp smoke, no matter how carefully they were folded or stored. Benjamin's journals developed faint warping along the edges from constant dampness carried through the Atlantic air. Their daughter's toys rolled gently across the floor whenever stronger waves lifted the hull unevenly during the night. Meals required balance and adjustment as plates shifted slightly with the motion beneath the table. Even silence aboard the vessel possessed texture. Lantern chains tapping softly overhead, the slow pulse of waves against the outer hull, distant footsteps crossing the deck during lonely watches before dawn. The brigantine surrounded its passengers completely, shaping thought and sensation through continuous contact with sea and movement. Over time, habits deepened into quiet rituals that helped structure life within the confined world of the ship. Benjamin checked weather conditions each evening with disciplined attention before joining his family below deck for brief periods of rest. Sarah organized small domestic routines around changing sea conditions, securing objects before rough weather, and opening the cabin slightly during calmer hours to invite fresher air inside. Their daughter developed favorite corners of the vessel where she liked to sit, watching gulls, clouds, or distant waves passing endlessly beside the hull. Crew members also settled into familiar patterns shaped partly by the family's presence aboard. Greetings became warmer. Movements near the cabin softened during late hours. The brigantine evolved gradually into a small community held together by routine, responsibility, and the shared isolation of Atlantic travel. Yet beneath the ordinary comfort of these repeated habits, the voyage continued, carrying everyone toward an unknowable future hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. None aboard the brigantine could have sensed how later generations would study scattered details from their lives with fascination and unease. At that moment, the Briggs family remained deeply rooted in the practical reality of 19th century maritime existence. They worried about weather, navigation, health, supplies, and the long distance separating them from land. Their emotional world centered upon immediate human concerns rather than future legend. The prayer books, folded clothing, handwritten notes, and quiet family routines aboard the brigantine belonged entirely to living people moving carefully through ordinary days at sea. Beyond the cabin walls, the Atlantic rolled onward beneath changing skies, carrying the vessel steadily toward the mystery history would never fully explain. The charts were open. The logbook was updated. The child's shoes sat by the wall. And then, the world stopped. A frayed rope dragging in the water. A sharp axe mark on the rail. No blood. No struggle. Just an empty horizon. What drove a seasoned captain to throw his family into a small boat in the middle of a freezing ocean? The answers lie below the deck, inside the cargo hold. The terrifying truth will be revealed in just 48 hours.